Welcome, students of Gender and Involvement. This is GAD 1204, Introduction to Feminist Theory. I hope you are well there, wherever the lockdown found you. We wanted to return in some ways and trace ourselves in terms of where we left each other when COVID-19 came in, and try to harmonize our positions as we go forward in the online learning. In this course, Introduction to Feminist Theory, that had run almost for a month or so, we had covered an introduction, basically looking at what is feminism, but also helping each other to understand why does feminist theory come on board in terms of understanding gender relations. We argued strongly that feminism as a theory comes to account for different experiences of women, particularly experiences of oppression, exploitation and subordination, but also putting in place measures to empower women out of those marginal positions. We talked about liberal feminism with Dr. Catherine Anena, who took you through what the theory is about and the key concepts that are often covered in there. This theory of liberal feminism that is largely informed by liberal feminist thought articulated women's subordination and argued that women are subordinate or unequal to men because of lacking particular opportunities that men are enabled to have. So using the concept of access, this theory largely talks about women's deprivation in terms of opportunities like education, in terms of employment, political participation, and argues that women are subordinate because they are denied those opportunities. And as a result of that, liberal feminists argue that if you want to promote equality between men and women, you need to include women into spheres where they are excluded. Enable them to have an education, enable them to participate in politics, enable them to be part of the employment sector, and they argue that those forms of inclusion give women opportunities and enable them to have an equal share of opportunities just as men are. You had the arguments there, you had the challenges that are embedded into that theoretical framework. Then you moved into understanding Marxist feminism that largely talks about class relations or how women are oppressed by class arrangements, classes of those, people who own resources, the bourgeoisie, but also those who work for the owners of resources. So Marxist feminists argue that women's oppression largely happens in that class of workers, and they talk about how gender division of labor, the distribution of roles, particularly limiting women into the domestic sphere, lead to women's exploitation. And they argue that it is only until the women have gained a certain level of consciousness about their disadvantagedness that they can be able to challenge these systems of oppression. When we moved from that, we went to radical feminism. There are quite interesting debates in there, but largely centering around the role of patriarchy in the oppression of women, because radical feminists argue that this kind of oppression, patriarchal oppression, is the most deep-rooted and the most qualitative oppression that women experience. And they argue that this kind of oppression is embedded in patriarchy, which is understood as male privilege, or the system that privileges male norms and values. And their argument is that if you want to end women oppression of this nature, you actually need to uproot patriarchy and its systems of oppression. You had an interesting conversations here still with Catherine Anena, and I hope you can still reconnect and engage in that way, looking at systems of oppression, looking at radical feminists who suggested biological revolution as a way of empowering women to take charge of their sexual and reproductive health, lives, all that. So when you look at this kind of evolution, I hope you still realize, you still remember and reconnect with this, but you will realize that these feminist theories were emerging in a particular sequence, that those preliminary forms of theorization actually provided a template upon which the preceding feminist theories drew. All these will be discussed in relation to each other as you read. So what we wanted to do is, we wanted to move to another feminist theory, which is called socialist feminism. And as we have noted, this one also emerges after liberal feminism, Marxist and radical and psychoanalytic feminism. And so its articulation, its argument, is largely based on some of the weaknesses of this. For instance, socialist feminists argue that women's oppression cannot be entirely accounted for by patriarchal experiences, or that it cannot be accounted for exclusively by economic relations, as Marxist feminists argue, but rather arguing for what they call intersectionality. They argue that women's oppression is as a result of an intersection of patriarchy, of class oppression, but also of denial of particular opportunities in communities where they find themselves. So this particularly looks at the intersection between patriarchy and capitalism. How patriarchy intersects with capitalism to lead to the oppression of women. So this is the theory that we are going on. I have shared one of the readings that you should take seriously, read through, and look at what socialist feminism is, what its central argument is in terms of explaining oppression of women, and the kind of strategies they flaunt to address women's oppression. Largely in there, you will meet gender division of labor, you will meet dual system theory. So I want you to read that handout, pay attention to it, look at the theorists in there, look at the ideas they front, look at the arguments they make, and look at how this theory and its explanations might speak into the experiences of women in the contemporary societies where we find ourselves. Along this exercise, I have shared an outline of how you can read this chapter, but also one question which you will need to answer after reading this handout. So in that way, we hope that we will be meeting every week. On Tuesday, we will be sharing one reading which each one of you must read and understand. If there is any question that is emerging from that reading, then you can forward it to me through my email as we wait for the Makerere University e-learning environment platform to be active. And then we will be meeting Friday for the second time, where I will be sharing critical notes on that particular theory that we will be dealing with in the week, as well as a short video on what we have studied or what we have read and reflected on. So I want to thank you. I want to thank you for the patience as the university looks for appropriate ways of resuming face-to-face studies. And I urge you to continue reading, but most importantly, to keep the hope up and to keep safe as we stay trying to tame the spread of this pandemic, COVID-19. So I wish you all the best for this week. We meet on Friday as we discuss what you have read and comprehended from socialist feminist theory. All the best. See you then.